everybody, welcome to On This Day in Tudor History with me, Claire Ridgway, author of On This Day in Tudor History. Where am I taking you back to today? Well, the reign of King Edward VI. For On This Day in Tudor History, the 12th of April 1550, courtier and poet Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, was born. Now, Edward was the only son of John de Vere, 16th Earl of Oxford, and his second wife, Marjorie Golding. Edward became the Earl of Oxford in 1562 after the death of his father. Now, here are some facts about this man, whose name you might have heard of. He's quite a famous Tudor man. Edward was made a royal ward following the death of his father, and William Cecil, who you'll of course know as Lord Burleigh, that famous advisor of Queen Elizabeth I, he was master of the Court of Wards at the time, and he became Edward's guardian and took sort of control of his education, appointed tutors to educate him and really controlled his education. Edward was granted an honorary master's from Cambridge in 1564 and from Oxford in September 1566 as one of Queen Elizabeth I's retinue on her visits to the cities as part of her progresses. Now, Edward killed an unarmed man in 1567 while practising fencing, the sport of fencing. But the coroner's jury found in Edward's favour, ruling that the man had actually committed suicide by running at Oxford's rapier. Sounds a bit dodgy to me, but yeah, I think it might have been because of who he was and who he was linked to. In 1570, after begging William Cecil for some military experience, he was sent to Scotland with the Earl of Sussex campaigning there. A year later, in 1571, he married Cecil's daughter, Anne, but the marriage was unhappy. And this is actually a marriage that I've mentioned before. I did a whole talk on Anne Cecil and her unhappy marriage to Oxford, so I'll give you a link to my talk on that in the description. Now, the Earl of Oxford was not the nicest of men, by the sounds of it. In the company of friends, he liked to make fun of Queen Elizabeth I. He insulted poet Philip Sidney and may even apparently have plotted his murder. Of course, Sidney wasn't actually murdered. Then in 1580, the very friends that he used to get together with to deride Queen Elizabeth I, to have a joke at Elizabeth's expense, well, those friends, he actually reported them, Henry Howard and Charles Arundel, to the Queen for their Catholic faith. So he could turn against you, not a very nice man. In 1581, Oxford ended up in the Tower of London. This was because his mistress, one of the Queen's ladies, Anne Vavasour, had given birth to his son. And of course, he wasn't meant to be messing around with one of the Queen's ladies. Fortunately for Oxford, it was a temporary imprisonment and he was released after just a couple of months and had to return to his wife, Anne Cecil. In 1582, Oxford fought a duel with his mistress's uncle, Sir Thomas Knivet. They were both injured, not fatally, so that's good. Although over the coming months, servants on both sides would actually die due to their arguments. So they may have not fought again, but their servants did. In 1586, Oxford was one of those who served on the commission that tried Mary, Queen of Scots. And we have the bells ringing out for her there. And in 1589 and 1601, he was one of the peers who sat in judgment on Philip Howard, Earl of Arundel, and then Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex. His wife, Anne, died in 1588, and in 1592 he married Elizabeth Trentham, who gave him a son, Henry, in 1593. In 1603, which was of course the year that Queen Elizabeth I died, Oxford was one of those who was actually against the succession of King James VI of Scotland as James I, King of England. He died on the 24th of June 1604 and he was buried in St Augustine's churchyard in Hackney, London. Oxford might have been a rather nasty piece of work, well, in my opinion, but he loved music and he was a patron of a company of players from 1580 to 1602. He also acted as a literary patron and he wrote poetry. Now let's get into what has actually made him famous and why you might have already heard of this Tudor gentleman. Well, Oxfordians believe that he wrote the plays and poems, the sonnets, attributed to the bard William Shakespeare. But Oxford's biographer Alan H. Nelson and many others believe that this theory is entirely without merit. There's no evidence to back it up. I have to admit that I'm rather biased in this respect. I grew up just a few miles from Stratford-upon-Avon. Stratford-upon-Avon was where I went all the time. I studied English literature as well. I've done lots of the works of Shakespeare. I'm a huge fan of William Shakespeare, and I believe that William Shakespeare wrote his work, so very biased. But this theory, along with the theories that Christopher Marlowe wrote them or that Francis Bacon wrote them, they are interesting to look into. For me personally, the evidence put forward for William Shakespeare having written the works that are attributed to William Shakespeare, that evidence is far more compelling. I'll give you a link to a very interesting interview with Shakespeare scholar Professor Jonathan Bate. He's being interviewed on this very topic and he makes some excellent points. One thing that for me points to William Shakespeare having written the plays he's famous for is the fact that there are numerous references in his works to gloves and leatherwork, with glove making being the trade of his father, John Shakespeare. John Shakespeare was a whistler. He was a leather worker. He made gloves for a living. I went to Shakespeare's birthplace just a couple of years ago on a historical tour, and our guide Ashley, who was showing us around, informed our group that there are over 70 references to gloves and glove making in William Shakespeare's works. And that would seem a bit odd, surely, if you haven't had some experience of glove making and gloves. So that's quite an interesting point. Oh, and according to some people, Edward de Vere was also the illegitimate son of Queen Elizabeth I. This is an opinion, a theory that has been put forward by Paul Streitz. He dates Oxford's birth to 1548, which is a bit different to other people's theory of his birth, and believes that he was the result of Elizabeth's relationship with Thomas Seymour, husband of her guardian and stepmother, Catherine Parr, the Queen Dowager. You'll remember, possibly from talks I've done before, that while Elizabeth was a teenager living in Catherine Parr's household after the death of Henry VIII, when Catherine was married to Thomas Seymour, that Thomas Seymour did act rather inappropriately with the young princess. And there is this theory that when she was sent away from the household, that is when she gave birth to Edward de Vere. Paul Streitz argues that this love child was placed with John de Vere, Earl of Oxford, and he uses the fact that Edward de Vere became a royal ward and that his education was overseen by people in high places like William Cecil as proof, as evidence that Edward de Vere was in fact royal. I don't find that theory compelling either. Cecil was master of the court of wards, and this was the late Earl of Oxford's son. He was an important little boy. It doesn't point to him being royal in my view. So there's nothing at all unusual, I feel, in what happened. still this story does add interest to the story of Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford. I'm going to leave you with some links in the description for further reading on Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford, and the Shakespeare author question, and works by the Earl of Oxford too. Also on this day in Tudor history, the 12th of April 1533, Queen Anne Boleyn made her first public appearance as King Henry VIII's official queen and wife, queen consort. And she didn't half set tongues wagging by doing this. She processed to mass accompanied by 60 ladies, so quite a sight. And not only that, she was dressed to the nines, loads of jewellery, finery, and you can find out all about that, contemporary descriptions of this event in last year's video, which I'll give you a link to. Now you can subscribe by clicking round about there. You can hit the bell to be notified as these videos go live, and you can of course give me a like and leave me a comment. Perhaps you want to tell me how you feel about Edward de Vere, the story, the idea that he was Elizabeth I's son, or that he wrote the works of William Shakespeare. Take care, see you tomorrow. Bye bye.